This is not just a story about borders. It is not about politics, nor ancient rivalries. It is the story of a people, the Palestinian people, robbed of their land, their homes, their dignity, by one of the most brutal colonial projects in modern history, Zionism. For over a century, the Muslim Ummah has watched one of its most sacred lands, the blessed land of Al-Quds, fall into the grip of a project forged in racism, powered by Western imperialism and defended with lies. Zionism was never a movement of peace. It was never about safety. From its very beginning, it was a settler colonial project, one that believed an entire people must vanish so another could reign. The West called it a miracle. But we, the people of faith, of memory, of resistance, know it by its true name: Nakba. Catastrophe, ethnic cleansing, genocide in silence. This documentary tells the story the media refuses to show, the story of children shot for holding flags, of families bulldozed for existing, of masjids desecrated, of mothers burying their sons with Qur'ans in their hands. But it is not only a story of oppression, it is a story of resistance, of stones against tanks, of faith against fear, of a people who, though caged and starved, refused to kneel before tyranny. In the face of occupation, betrayal, and siege, Palestinians remain rooted. Their strength is not in weapons, but in conviction. Their battlefield is not just Gaza, but every street, every soul, every sujood made under drones. This is not just their fight, this is our fight. For Masjid al-Aqsa, for the dignity of our Ummah, for truth against a regime built on lies. To understand the occupation of Palestine, we must first understand the ideology that gave it life: Zionism. Unlike Judaism, which is a religion followed by millions around the world, Zionism is a political movement that emerged in 19th century Europe. It did not arise from scripture or divine revelation, but from the racist and exclusionary politics of the West. Ironically, Zionism was not born in the ghettos of Europe as a peaceful answer to Jewish persecution. It was born in the salons of secular nationalists who embraced European imperial logic and turned it into a blueprint for conquest. The center of this movement was Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist who is often labeled the father of Zionism. In 1896, Herzl published Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, in which he argued that Jews could never live safely in Europe due to persistent anti-Semitism. His solution: create a state exclusively for Jews, governed by Jews, and separate from the rest of the world. But unlike the prophets of old, Herzl's dream was not a return to religion. It was a secular nationalist project, rooted not in Torah, but in territory. From the very beginning, Zionism was a colonial idea. Herzl considered locations like Uganda and Argentina for the Jewish homeland. His primary concern was not faith, but land. Eventually, the Zionists turned their eyes toward Palestine, a land already inhabited by a Muslim-majority population, living peacefully in a shared society. The Zionists saw this as irrelevant. In the words of Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky, colonization can only proceed under the protection of a force. Zionism is a colonizing adventure. These were not the words of religious pilgrims, they were the words of invaders. To justify their aims, early Zionists spread the myth that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. This was not merely a lie. It was a deliberate erasure of over 500,000 Palestinians who lived, farmed, and prayed there. By painting Palestine as empty, Zionist leaders dehumanized its people and laid the groundwork for their eventual dispossession. Historical records prove the opposite. In the late 1800s, under Ottoman rule, Palestine was a thriving and diverse society. Muslims were the majority, but there were also Christian and Jewish communities living in harmony. Jerusalem was not a battlefield, it was a city of faith. But the Zionist movement, influenced by European racial theories and white supremacy, viewed the native Palestinian Arabs as backward, uncivilized, and expendable. In this way, Zionism mirrored other European settler colonial projects, like the conquest of the Americas and apartheid South Africa. The ambitions of Zionism would have remained fantasies were it not for British imperial support. In 1917, during World War I, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued a letter to Lord Rothschild, known today as the infamous Balfour Declaration. In it, Britain pledged to support the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, despite the fact that 90% of the population was not Jewish. It was a promise made by a colonial power to another colonial movement over a land it did not own. The betrayal was monumental. While Britain promised Arabs independence in return for revolting against the Ottomans, they simultaneously promised Palestine to the Zionists. It was a dagger in the back of the Muslim Ummah. The British occupation of Palestine after World War I paved the way for mass Jewish immigration and the systematic marginalization of native Palestinians. Zionist militias began to organize, train, and prepare for war, backed by the British military. As Jewish immigration increased, so did violence. Zionist paramilitary groups like Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi began attacking Palestinian villages, assassinating British officials, and terrorizing anyone who stood in their way. These were not fringe radicals. They were supported by the Zionist leadership. One of the most notorious attacks was the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946, which killed 91 people. Men like Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, who led these terror groups, would later become prime ministers of Israel, proof that terrorism was not an exception, but the foundation of the Zionist state. Palestinian resistance began to emerge in response, but they were fighting an uphill battle, armed with only basic weapons and no international support, up against a movement that had global sympathy, colonial backing, and a powerful propaganda machine. Zionists depicted themselves as helpless refugees, while carrying out systematic violence against Palestinian civilians. One of the Zionists' greatest weapons was their control over narrative. In Europe and America, the suffering of European Jews during the Holocaust was used to justify the establishment of Israel. The horrors of Nazi Germany were real, but they were manipulated to paint Zionists as innocent survivors, when in fact they were militarized occupiers enforcing apartheid and displacement. Western media, heavily influenced by Zionist lobbies, ignored Palestinian suffering. Words like terrorist, extremist, and anti-Semitic were used to label any Muslim who dared to speak the truth. Peaceful resistance was crushed, and violent resistance was demonized. Meanwhile, Israeli violence was labeled as self-defense, even when it targeted women and children. It is essential to separate Zionism from Judaism. Many Jews around the world, both religious and secular, oppose Zionism. From the beginning, Orthodox Jewish groups like Neturei Karta have denounced Israel as a heretical and anti-Torah project. They believe that only the Messiah can establish a Jewish homeland, and any attempt to do so through war and colonization is forbidden. The Quran, too, speaks of the Israelites' past and praises their prophets, but it does not give license for modern-day theft and bloodshed. Zionism has hijacked Jewish identity and used it as a shield against criticism. Any condemnation of Israeli war crimes is labeled anti-Semitic, when in reality, it is anti-colonial and anti-oppression. Muslims must remember that our opposition is not to a religion, but to a political ideology that has inflicted genocide upon our brothers and sisters. By the mid-1940s, Zionist militias were no longer hiding their intentions. Plans like the infamous Plan Dalet outlined the ethnic cleansing of entire Palestinian towns. The goal was simple: to remove as many Arabs as possible and declare a Jewish majority by force. In 1948, these plans were carried out in what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed from their homes. Thousands were killed. Hundreds of villages were erased from existence. And the Zionist dream was fulfilled through Muslim blood. The United Nations, driven by Western guilt and colonial interest, recognized the State of Israel in 1948. It was a slap in the face to the Palestinian people. The so-called peace process became a smokescreen for further annexation and occupation. Zionism had succeeded, not through diplomacy, but through displacement. In 1917, with the Muslim world already reeling from the dismemberment of the Ottoman Caliphate, a single sentence sealed the fate of an entire nation. It read, "His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people." With these few lines, the British Empire handed over a Muslim-majority land to a Zionist movement, without consultation, without legitimacy, and without the consent of the very people who had lived there for centuries. This infamous letter, known as the Balfour Declaration, was not just a betrayal, it was the beginning of a global conspiracy to uproot Palestine from the Muslim Ummah. It laid the political foundation for the occupation, ethnic cleansing, and systematic erasure of an entire population. In the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was described as the sick man of Europe, a term used by colonial powers eager to divide its lands. The Sultan still held the symbolic title of Caliph, and Palestine remained under Ottoman rule, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted for centuries. But Zionists, having failed to secure support from the Ottomans, who rejected their offers to buy Palestine, turned to the rising imperial power, Britain. They knew that the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate would open the door for foreign occupation, and they were ready to capitalize. World War I offered a golden opportunity. The British were fighting the Ottomans in the Middle East and needed Arab support to defeat them, so they initiated the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, secretly promising Arab independence in exchange for an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. At the same time, however, Britain was engaged in the Sykes-Picot Agreement with France and Russia, dividing the Muslim lands of the Middle East between colonial powers before the war even ended. And on top of this, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, making a third promise, this time to Zionists, that Palestine would become a Jewish national home. In other words, Britain betrayed everyone. It deceived the Arabs with false promises of independence. It colluded with France to carve up Muslim lands. It sold Palestine to a foreign settler movement that had no religious or ancestral claim to the land. Arthur Balfour was not a champion of religious minorities. He was, in fact, an anti-Semite who had earlier passed the Aliens Act of 1905 in Britain to prevent Jewish immigration. But why would a man who disliked Jews support a Jewish homeland in Palestine? The answer is colonial interest. Balfour and his allies saw Zionism as a way to plant a Western-aligned pro-British outpost in the heart of the Muslim world. Zionists would act as loyal clients in a region Britain wanted to dominate, especially with the Suez Canal and oil resources nearby. Palestine was not gifted to the Jews out of sympathy. It was handed over to fulfill Britain's imperial ambitions. In Balfour's own words, Zionism is of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. This one sentence reveals the racist logic behind the declaration. The Arabs were invisible, their rights irrelevant. Palestine was treated not as a homeland, but as a colonial trophy. The Balfour Declaration didn't come out of thin air. It was the result of years of lobbying by Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann, a chemist and prominent Zionist who worked closely with British officials. Weizmann convinced the British elite that Zionism would serve their interests, arguing that a Jewish state in Palestine would secure Britain's hold over the Middle East. Zionist influence grew so strong that they were even allowed to draft parts of the declaration themselves. In fact, Balfour didn't even consult the Palestinian people. The native inhabitants of the land were reduced to a mere non-Jewish population in the document, a grotesque denial of their humanity. The Zionists promised cooperation and loyalty, and Britain gave them the land. A deadly alliance was born. After World War I, the League of Nations handed Britain the mandate over Palestine. In reality, this was just a polished version of occupation. Britain now had legal cover to reshape the land according to Zionist goals. Between 1920 and 1948, Britain opened the gates for mass Jewish immigration into Palestine, arming Zionist militias, training them, and suppressing Palestinian resistance. Palestinians protested, rose up, and even organized nationwide strikes, but were brutally crushed. One of the most powerful moments of Palestinian resistance came during the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt, but the British, with help from Zionist fighters, suppressed the uprising with extreme force, executing hundreds of Muslims, destroying homes, and outlawing political groups. While the world applauded Britain as a civilizer, it was in reality preparing Palestine for Zionist conquest. The British understood that division is the key to domination, so they deliberately disarmed Palestinians while arming Zionist militias like Haganah, undermined Islamic scholars and imprisoned community leaders, banned Palestinian newspapers that exposed the betrayal, pitted Muslims against Christians, and weakened the spirit of unified resistance. Through cunning manipulation, Britain created the conditions for a Zionist takeover while claiming neutrality to the world. In 1937, the British proposed a partition plan, giving a majority of Palestine to the Zionists and a small portion to the Palestinians. This was like offering someone's house to a robber and asking the owner to be reasonable.
The Palestinians rejected it. Why? Because it legitimized theft.
They saw what the Zionists were doing, taking land, building settlements, and preparing for war. Any partition would only embolden them, but Britain persisted. Every peace plan ignored the basic reality. Palestine was not Britain's to give, and Zionism was not a liberation movement. It was a settler colonial project. As the 1940s approached, Britain realized the Zionists were ready to take Palestine by force. It had trained and armed them long enough. When World War II ended and the Holocaust's horrors came to light, the Zionists increased their propaganda, demanding a state immediately. Meanwhile, Britain began to step aside, knowing it had already handed over the tools of conquest. In 1948, the British withdrew, and the Zionist militias launched full-scale attacks on Palestinian villages. Thus began the Nakba, the mass expulsion and massacre of Palestinians, which will be covered in the next chapter. Britain's hands were stained with blood. It had nurtured the Zionist project from its birth and left it in the hands of terrorists who would go on to become prime ministers and war criminals. In 1948, the Muslim world witnessed one of the greatest tragedies in modern history, the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. While the Western world celebrated the so-called birth of Israel, over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, over 500 towns and villages were systematically destroyed, and thousands of innocent civilians, men, women, and children, were murdered in cold blood. This was not a war between two equal sides. This was an organized campaign of ethnic cleansing, carried out by Zionist militias, blessed by the West and ignored by most of the world. To Palestinians and Muslims globally, this wasn't merely a humanitarian crisis, it was an Islamic calamity, the violent theft of sacred Muslim land and the deliberate annihilation of centuries of Islamic civilization. This chapter exposes the reality behind the Nakba, a crime that Zionists continue to deny, and the Muslim world has failed to fully avenge. Zionist leaders knew that a Jewish state could not be established in a land overwhelmingly populated by non-Jews. In 1947, Jews made up only about 30% of the population and owned less than 7% of the land. Yet the UN partition plan, under Zionist pressure and Western manipulation, granted them 56% of Palestine. From the very beginning, the plan was absurd and unjust. The Zionists didn't accept this land as a gift. They saw it as a launching pad. With a clear strategy of conquest, militias such as Haganah, Agun, and Lehi carried out dozens of calculated massacres, spreading fear to force Palestinians to flee. This was not spontaneous violence. It was deliberate ethnic cleansing guided by military orders like Plan Dalit, Plan D. On April 9, 1948, Zionist forces attacked the peaceful Palestinian village of Deir Yassin, near Jerusalem. The villagers had previously made peace agreements with nearby Jewish communities. Yet, over 120 armed Zionist fighters invaded the town, going house to house, executing families including women, children, and the elderly. Victims were raped, mutilated, and paraded through streets as trophies. Eyewitnesses testified that bodies were dumped in wells and streets. Over 110 innocent civilians were slaughtered in this single massacre. Deir Yassin was not the only one, but it became a symbol of terror. News of the massacre spread like wildfire, prompting many terrified Palestinians to flee, believing they would be next. This was psychological warfare, aimed at depopulating Palestine through fear. Zionist troops continued this campaign across the land. Al-Tantura massacre, May 1948. Over 200 Palestinians, mostly unarmed men, were rounded up and executed after surrendering. Mass graves were recently discovered under Israeli resorts and parking lots. Al-Dawayima, October 1948. Over 100 Palestinians, including women and children, were killed. Witnesses describe children's skulls smashed with rifle butts and entire families locked in houses and blown up with explosives. Lida and Ramleh, July 1948. After bombarding the cities, Zionist militias forced nearly 70,000 Palestinians to march in scorching heat without water. Hundreds died during the forced expulsion. These are now known as the Lida and Ramleh death marches. These atrocities were not accidental. They were systematically carried out to cleanse the land and create a Jewish majority. The goal was clear: remove the native Muslim population at any cost. The Zionist narrative claims that the Arabs left voluntarily, but this This is an outright lie refuted by historical documents, UN reports, and even testimonies of former Israeli soldiers. In reality, Palestinians were forced to leave at gunpoint. Entire villages were bombed and flattened. Returnees were shot dead as they attempted to go back to their homes. Mosques were desecrated, Qurans burned, and cemeteries bulldozed. Many Muslims today are unaware of the scale of destruction. Zionists renamed towns, erased Arabic names, planted European-style forests over destroyed villages to hide the evidence. The very identity of Palestine was targeted for extinction. By the end of 1948, over 750,000 Palestinians had become refugees in neighboring Arab countries: Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt. Many lived in tents and remain in refugee camps to this day. Generations were born in exile, stripped of citizenship, identity, and dignity. International law guarantees refugees the right of return, yet Israel denies this to Palestinians, even while allowing Jews from Europe or America to settle in Palestine under the law of return. This is religious apartheid. Zionism created a state not of peace, but of institutional racism, where Muslims have no right to return, and settlers are welcomed as natives. While Jerusalem, Al-Quds, was eventually divided in the 1948 war, the Zionist plan to fully capture the Holy City was already in motion. The Muslims of Jerusalem were attacked, their properties seized, their institutions crushed. Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, was placed under siege, with restrictions on prayer and access. To this day, Israeli occupation forces continue to storm the mosque, beat worshippers, and desecrate its sanctity. The Zionists did not come as peaceful immigrants. They came as armed colonizers, determined to erase Islamic presence from Palestine's heart. While Palestine burned, most Muslim leaders were either under colonial rule or too divided and weak to respond. Arab armies intervened but lacked unity, strategy, or real willpower. In some cases, betrayal came from within. The Zionist forces, unified, well-armed, and supported by the West, defeated fragmented Arab armies. Israel declared independence in May 1948, and the Western powers rushed to recognize it. The United Nations watched the catastrophe unfold and did nothing. The Ummah failed Palestine, and the consequences continue to haunt us to this day. When Israel declared itself a state in 1948, it was not a peaceful emergence. It was a state built upon mass killings, the destruction of 500+ villages, expulsion of 750,000 Muslims, theft of homes, mosques, land and businesses, the desecration of Islamic heritage. Every Israeli Independence Day is a day of mourning for Palestinians. While Israelis dance in Tel Aviv, Palestinians weep in exile, holding keys to homes that no longer exist. Many Israeli historians today, such as Ilan Pappé in The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, have admitted that Zionist forces carried out pre-planned acts of ethnic cleansing. Former soldiers have confessed to killings, rapes, and the destruction of villages. Survivors of the Nakba tell stories of babies shot in their cradles, fathers burned alive, women violated in front of their families. These are not myths, these are the testimonies of a silenced nation. Yet to this day, Zionist politicians deny it all. They claim there was no Palestine, or that Arabs fled on their own. These lies are recycled in media, textbooks, and foreign policy, while the truth lies buried under rubble. The Nakba never ended in 1948. It continues to this very day. Homes in Jerusalem are demolished daily. Palestinians in Gaza live under siege without electricity, clean water, or medicine. Muslim worshippers are attacked at Al-Aqsa. Thousands of Palestinians are imprisoned, including women and children. Israeli settlers torch olive trees and spit on the Quran. The Zionist state was built on genocide, and it sustains itself through apartheid and oppression. For decades, Israel has marketed itself to the world as a beacon of democracy, a modern state in a barbaric region, and the only democracy in the Middle East. But behind the propaganda, behind the high-tech facade and carefully orchestrated Western alliances lies a state that operates on pure racial supremacy. A state where your ethnicity determines your rights, where walls, checkpoints, and curfews enforce apartheid, where one group lives in privilege and another lives in permanent captivity. The so-called State of Israel is not a democracy, it is a military dictatorship for Palestinians and a Zionist ethno-state for Jews. This chapter exposes the ugly truth of apartheid in modern-day Israel and the suffering it has inflicted upon the Muslim population of historic Palestine. In the early 2000s, Israel began constructing what it called a security fence along the West Bank. In reality, it is an 8-meter-high concrete wall, longer than the Berlin Wall, built deep inside Palestinian territory. It snakes through towns, cuts across farmland, and isolates entire communities. Its real name is the Apartheid Wall, and its purpose is not protection, but segregation. Palestinians on one side live in open-air prisons. Israelis on the other live in gated settlements with full access to roads, water, electricity, and security. Palestinians need permits to cross their own land. Muslim worshippers are often denied access to Al-Aqsa simply because of their ID. This wall is a monument to racial division, a permanent scar on the land of prophets. There are over 700 military checkpoints and roadblocks throughout the West Bank. These are not border controls, this is apartheid infrastructure. Every day, Palestinians must pass through these barriers just to go to school, work, hospitals, or prayer. They are strip-searched in public, interrogated by teenage Israeli soldiers with rifles, forced to wait for hours in cages like cattle, denied entry for arbitrary reasons, wrong clothes, wrong name, wrong attitude. Women in labor have been forced to give birth at checkpoints. Patients have died because ambulances were delayed. Children have been shot for suspicious movement. The checkpoint system is not about security, it's about submission. In the occupied West Bank, two parallel legal systems exist. Jews living in illegal settlements are tried under Israeli civil law with full legal protections. Palestinians are tried under Israeli military law, which allows detention without trial, use of secret evidence, military judges, no access to lawyers during interrogation. This is textbook apartheid. A child from Tel Aviv caught throwing a stone is given a warning. A Palestinian child from Hebron can be jailed for 20 years for the same act. Even inside Israel's 1948 borders, over 2 million Palestinian citizens live under an elaborate system of legal and economic discrimination. They are denied access to dozens of Jewish-only towns. They receive inferior education, healthcare, and infrastructure. They are profiled, harassed, and monitored by security agencies. They cannot build homes without permits, which are rarely granted. In many professions, they are excluded through subtle racial quotas. Israeli law defines Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, making Muslims permanent outsiders in their own homeland. While the West Bank suffers under occupation, Gaza suffers under siege. Since 2007, Israel has imposed a full land, sea, and air blockade on Gaza, trapping over 2 million people, half of whom are children. Electricity is limited to 2 to 4 hours a day. Clean water is nearly non-existent. Medical supplies are blocked. Fishing is restricted to a few miles. Farming is dangerous. Israeli snipers target farmers. Buildings destroyed in wars remain in ruins for years. Israel controls what enters Gaza. Even items like chocolate, cement, crayons, and medical equipment have been blocked. UN experts describe Gaza as unlivable. This is not security. This is mass punishment. Israel repeatedly bombs Gaza using F-16s, drones, and artillery, claiming to target militants. Yet every war results in mass civilian deaths, children buried under rubble, mosques flattened, schools, hospitals, and press offices destroyed. During the 2014 war, over 2,200 Palestinians were killed. 70% civilians, including 551 children. Entire families were erased. Yet the world said nothing. Western governments praised Israel for its restraint. This is the double standard. Muslim blood is cheap. Zionist lies are sacred. The Zionist regime has always targeted Al-Aqsa Mosque, not just for political reasons, but because it represents Islamic presence and unity. Armed settlers storm the mosque compound regularly under police protection. Muslim worshippers are beaten and arrested, sometimes even while praying. Islamic Waqf authorities are undermined. Zionist groups openly call for the demolition of Al-Aqsa to build a third temple. This is not just occupation, it's religious warfare. Al-Aqsa is not just a Palestinian issue, it is an Ummah issue. Yet Yet how many Muslim leaders speak out? Across the West Bank, over 750,000 Israeli settlers live in fortified compounds built on stolen land. These settlements are protected by the Israeli army, connected by Jewish-only roads, guarded by walls and watchtowers, built in violation of international law. Palestinians are often evicted from their homes, sometimes in the dead of night, to make way for settlers. Olive trees are uprooted, mosques vandalized, children beaten, and the world watches silently. These settlements are not neighborhoods. They are Zionist colonies built to erase Muslim existence. In Israeli schools, children are taught that Arabs are invaders, that Palestine never existed, that Jewish supremacy is ordained, that the Nakba is a myth. This is state-sponsored indoctrination. Zionism breeds hate not just through guns, but through minds. Generations of Israelis grow up believing that Palestinian Muslims are obstacles to be removed, not humans to be respected. Israel has designed its regime to control every aspect of Palestinian life. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, and IDs are issued by the occupation. Travel between cities requires permits. Worship at Al-Aqsa is restricted based on age, gender, or mood of a soldier. Freedom of speech is punished. Journalists and activists are jailed. Surveillance cameras and drones monitor every street, school, and mosque. This is not a democracy. It is totalitarianism, with racial laws to justify it. Some examples of legal apartheid: law of return. Any Jew in the world can return to Israel, even if they have no connection to the land. Meanwhile, the real natives, the Palestinians, are banned from returning. Nation-state law 2018 declares that only Jews have the right to self-determination in Israel. Absentee property law allows Israel to confiscate land from Palestinians who fled during war, even if they live next door. Citizenship law prevents Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza from marrying citizens of Israel and receiving residency. These laws are not accidental. They are tools to preserve racial dominance. When the world turned its back, when the mosques were silenced, when homes crumbled beneath the roar of F-16s, a new voice rose from the dust and rubble. It was not the voice of diplomats nor of soldiers. It was the cry of the people, the cry of Palestine. They called it the Intifada, Arabic for uprising. But to the Zionist regime, it was something more terrifying, a people who refused to be erased. By the 1980s, decades of military occupation had choked every breath of freedom in the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinians were not just oppressed, they were caged. Every permit denied, every olive tree uprooted, every mosque under siege pushed the people closer to a breaking point. On December 8, 1987, an Israeli truck rammed into a group of Palestinian workers in Gaza, killing 4. To the world, it was an accident. To Palestinians, it was a message, one more life lost in silence. The next day, the camps erupted. Children picked up stones. Mothers filled the streets. Mosques broadcast calls to rise, not with guns, but with faith, fists, and fire. In the first Intifada, the resistance had no army, no state, no air force. Its soldiers were 12-year-olds with slingshots. Its battlegrounds were alleyways and schoolyards. Its weapon was truth. But Israel responded with bullets, with curfews, with beatings. Over 1,200 Palestinians were killed, many of them children. Thousands more were arrested and tortured. Yet the uprising did not die. It spread like fire across the West Bank and Gaza. As the uprising grew, a new force emerged, one that fused faith with resistance. Born in the mosques of Gaza, Hamas positioned itself not only as a political group, but as a religious duty. Its slogan was simple: Islam is the solution, jihad is the path, Palestine is the prize. Unlike the PLO, Hamas rejected negotiation with the occupier. To them, Zionism was not just unjust, it was illegitimate. While the West called them radicals, the people called them protectors. As Israeli tanks rolled in, it was the masjids that filled with resistance, not fear. The world saw it as a breakthrough, a moment of peace. But for the Palestinian people, it was something else entirely, a handshake with the occupier. The Oslo Accords, signed in secret and celebrated in Washington, did not liberate Palestine, they carved it up. Area A under Palestinian Authority, Area B shared with Israel, and Area C over 60% of the West Bank, completely under Israeli control. Oslo was a disaster. It created a puppet government while Israeli settlements doubled. It gave the illusion of autonomy, but no sovereignty, no borders, no army, no real state. While Zionist politicians smiled for cameras, they built walls behind the scenes. Oslo gave Palestinians a flag, a desk, and a prison cell. On September 28, 2000, Ariel Sharon, war criminal and architect of massacres, walked into Al-Aqsa with an army. To Muslims, this was not a visit. It was a desecration. That single act lit the match. The Second Intifada exploded like a storm across Palestine. This time, the resistance was louder, more organized, and more determined. The Zionist response was brutal. Over 4,000 Palestinians were killed in the years that followed, over 40,000 wounded, over 10,000 arrested, and the majority civilians. The world watched in horror as a boy named Mohammed al-Dura died in his father's arms, his murder broadcast live, but nothing changed. No justice, no outcry, no consequence. As occupation deepened, so did desperation. Israel called it terrorism. Palestinians called it resistance. A new phase of the Intifada had begun, martyrdom operations. To the outside world, these were suicide bombings, but inside Gaza and the West Bank, they were acts of vengeance. For fathers assassinated, homes reduced to dust, and children shot at checkpoints. Figures like Sheikh Ahmad Yassin declared that when the world ignores your screams, you must fight with your soul. Israel martyred him with a missile as he left Fajr prayer. Every martyr they killed, 10 more rose in his place. As stones clashed with steel, the Zionist regime evolved. The new battlefield was invisible, digital. Gaza's skies became haunted by drones. Its streets became grids mapped by AI. Every phone, every message, every breath was watched. Israel launched an era of targeted assassinations, a euphemism for extrajudicial murder. Resistance leaders were vaporized in cars, their homes bombed while they slept, their phones rigged to explode. In trying to kill one man, they erased an entire apartment block. No trials, no evidence, just execution, carried out with American weapons and covered by Western silence. While the blood soaked Gaza's streets, Western media perfected the art of distortion. Zionist tanks became defensive patrols. Palestinian martyrs became militants. The word occupation was erased entirely. Even the truth was a target. In 2022, Israeli snipers killed Shireen Abu Akleh, a Christian Palestinian journalist wearing full press armor. The bullet pierced her head, and her voice shook the world. But from the ashes, a global movement began to rise. Young Muslims, students, scholars, activists across continents, waving Palestinian flags and chanting a truth that could no longer be hidden. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The Intifadas were not simply uprisings, they were declarations. From refugee camps to the mosques of Al-Quds, the message was the same. We are not victims, we are the resistance. The occupier has tanks, the oppressed has truth, and in that battle, truth always survives. They built walls, we built memory. They dropped bombs, we dropped names into history. They killed, we buried, they erased, we remembered. Intifada is not over. It lives in every prayer whispered at Al-Aqsa, in every mother who raises a son for jihad, in every soul that refuses to kneel before tyranny. The stones will rise again. There exists a place unlike any other on Earth, a sliver of land just 41 kilometers long, no airport, no seaport, no freedom of movement, surrounded by barbed wire, drones, and warships. 2 million souls trapped like animals. This is not fiction. This is Gaza. To Israel, it is a security threat. To the West, a Hamas stronghold. But to Muslims, it is a city of the steadfast, a symbol of Sabre, a scar on the conscience of the Ummah. In 2006, the Palestinian people exercised their right to vote. The world asked for democracy, and Gaza delivered. Hamas won, fairly, legally, decisively. But because the wrong side won, because Muslims voted for resistance, the punishment came swiftly. The siege began, not for war, not for violence, but for voting, a medieval blockade in a modern age. Israel sealed the land, air, and sea. Egypt, pressured by Tel Aviv and Washington, closed Rafah. Gaza became a cage. Every day in Gaza is a test of survival. Electricity comes for 4 hours on a good day. Hospitals run on generators. Cancer patients die waiting for permits. Clean water is a dream. 97% of it is undrinkable. Children fall asleep to the sound of drones, not lullabies. Even the sea is not theirs. Fish beyond 6 nautical miles is forbidden. Violate that invisible line, and you may not return. Yet the people remain. Laugh, marry, study, resist. They were told to die, but they chose to live with honor. On December 27th, 2008, Gaza awoke to fire. In a single day, over 100 bombs fell. Mosques collapsed. Schools vanished. Families were buried beneath their homes. Israel called it Operation Cast Lead. The world called it a response. But Palestinians knew what it was. A massacre, a punishment, a message to a people who dared resist. White phosphorus, illegal chemical weapons, rained over neighborhoods. Hospitals, UN shelters, and homes were all targeted. Not even the dead were spared. Cemeteries were shelled. There was no escape, no shelter. The borders were sealed. The sky was death. The bombs returned in 2012, in 2014, each time more brutal, each time more precise, each time with US weapons and Zionist impunity. In 2014, during Operation Protective Edge, over 2,200 Palestinians were killed in just 50 days. 551 of them were children. Whole families were wiped off the registry, eliminated, the IDF called it. The world watched in silence. News anchors used words like clashes and conflict, but there was no clash. There was a slaughter. To some, it was a war. To others, it was entertainment. In May 2021, Zionist forces desecrated Al-Aqsa again in Ramadan in the last 10 nights. The sanctuary of Islam was defiled by boots, batons, and bullets. From Jerusalem to Gaza, the Ummah awoke. The resistance responded, and Israel unleashed hell once more. They bombed media towers, killed whole families in their sleep. They targeted roads to hospitals. Gaza bled again. The most powerful weapon used against Gaza is not a bomb. It is time. The siege is designed not just to starve the body, but to break the soul. Children in Gaza are not born. They are forged. Born beneath siege, raised in ruins, taught to survive without light, water, or safety. Nearly half of Gaza's population is under 18. They have seen more war than most soldiers. And yet, they smile. They memorize the Quran. They speak of return, of honor, of Palestine. If Israel sealed the skies and the seas, Gaza dug beneath the earth. Resistance tunnels became arteries of survival, lifelines for food, medicine, and fighters. The world condemned the rockets, but said nothing of the bombs that provoked them. For every airstrike on a refugee camp, resistance answered. For every martyr, Gaza responded. Not with surrender, but with fire. We don't fight to win. We fight so the world remembers we are alive. For 17 years, the siege has held. With every war, Western leaders issued statements and then returned to business. The world moved on. Gaza remained buried. Even Muslim leaders betrayed the cause. Normalization became a trend.
But the Ummah has not forgotten. The youth of Islam rise with every Intifada. Their flags are not lowered. Their voices do not shake. Gaza has no army, no navy, no air force, but it has something greater. It has belief in Allah, in justice, in return. They tried to suffocate Gaza, but it breathed through resistance. They tried to starve it, but it was nourished by faith. They tried to break it, but Gaza stood taller than their walls. In every broken brick of Gaza, there is a heartbeat. In every tear, a prayer. In every martyr's grave, a seed. They tried to bury Gaza, but they forgot. Gaza is a flame. As long as the call to prayer rises from Al-Aqsa, as long as the kafiyah is worn in defiance, as long as one child stands with a stone in hand, Palestine lives. Gaza resists. The siege will fall, the people will return, and Palestine will be free.